In thinking more about what the edge means to me, in a metaphorical sense, I went back in my own life and realized that for the last 10 years, I've been living on an edge as well. A metaphorical edge. 10 years ago, October 2012, my mum walks into my room. We live an hour away, so in Epping. My mum walks into my room and she knocks on my door. I open the door and I said, "Mum, what's up?" And my mum, like all Indian parents here, aren't very emotional people. They're very stoic characters, especially if you're like children of immigrants, very stoic. Don't really express a lot of affection or emotion. But Mum walks in and she says, "Haynes, do you have a minute?" And I'm sure, "Sure, what's wrong?" And do you know when you're about to hear some bad news, there's a feeling in the air? You get that knot in your stomach that something's not right, something might go wrong. My mum sits me down and she says, "Haynes, your dad has stage 1 Parkinson's disease." And I'm like, "What? Like, what is that? Like, what is Parkinson's disease? Like, what does that mean for me? What's the cure? Is there a cure? What are the symptoms? What are the causes?" I was like a deer in headlights. I had no idea how to react. I was 18 with a world in front of me. I had to ask myself, what is Parkinson's, learn more about it, and be a student of Parkinson's. So what is Parkinson's? Parkinson's affects 1% of all Australians over 60. It is a neurodegenerative motor illness. What does that mean? It means that A, there's no cure for it. It gets worse progressively over time, and it's a movement-based disorder. So, Dad, for example, had a lot of tremors. So he would get the shakes a lot. His arms would shake. I'd never get him to take a selfie, ever. Because you just never take a still photo, right? He'd get a lot of rigidity. His body would be really, really stiff, almost like a statue. He once described it to me as, "Haynes, it's like having your feet tied together and stuck in sand." That's sort of what Parkinson's is like. And so with Parkinson's, it gets progressively worse over time, and there's no real cure for it. It's quite similar to Alzheimer's and dementia in that there are also mental impacts as well. So knowing what Parkinson's is, I have a question for everyone here tonight. How many of you have a parent that has a chronic illness? Raise your hand. Okay. So there's about a third of you here. Keep your hands raised if the parent that has a chronic illness, if you care for them, that will change your life completely. In other words, that in caring for your parent that has a chronic illness, your personal and professional goals are at risk. Right? There's a couple in the audience. And I was in that same boat as well. I worked in the US and I had a real decision to make. Do I come back to Australia and look after mum and dad, or do I sort of outsource it? Do I give it to someone else? In thinking about this, I realized there are only 3 main options that are available for folks that have parents with a chronic illness. Step 1, you live with your parents. It's not great, it's not glamorous, you can't have house parties, but it's an option. Option 2, you outsource the care to a third provider or an external party, an aged care centre, the NDIS. Option 3, you let them fend for themselves. Now, I wasn't about to do that to my parents, and I'm sure a lot of folks here with parents that have a chronic illness, that's just not an option. Option 2, outsourcing it. I did a lot of research on this. Aged care centres in Australia are hit and miss. The difference between a really high quality aged care centre and one that's much lower is immense. Aged care centres in Australia are chronically under-resourced. So that sort of left me with option 1. And so in making that decision and reflecting on that, it leads me to my message for all of you tonight that I want you to ponder on and remember. I want all of us to think of caregiving and looking after our parents as they get older, not as an obstacle that just happens and you just have to deal with it reluctantly. But I want you to think of caregiving in the same diligence, care, and rigour that you would apply at work. What do I mean by that? I want you to use the same tools and techniques and practices that you would use at work, but as a caregiver. And you might think, well, hang on a minute, Haynes, what do you mean by that? I'm not ready to look after my aging parents. I'm not ready to forego my career, and I'm just going to take it as it comes. But in my experience, failing to plan and allocate resources and research is probably the biggest reason why caregivers find this really, really difficult. So in reflecting, I found 3 main pillars, facets that I can talk about that can help you as a caregiver. Number 1 is clarity. Just being super clear on what you are optimizing for. Second is continuous improvement, having a growth mindset. 3, building resilience. And 4, having an oxygen mask. And I'll get to what that means in a second. So the first thing with clarity, my background is in corporate finance and startups. I worked at a company called Airwallex, and one of my colleagues that I used to work with, his parents had dementia and cancer, right? So really, really tough, super debilitating illness. I spoke to him, a couple of days before he left, and like a lot of people, just before they leave an organization, they get very philosophical. They start to open up a little bit. And so we had a couple of drinks one night, and he said, look, Haynes, it's really, really tough. Like, I'm not going to lie to you, this is really, really tough what you're about to do. And he said one thing in our conversations that really stuck with me. He's like, what are you optimizing for? Like, what is the goal here? Are you trying to get promoted and focus on your career at all costs? And in doing so, sort of forego some of your caregiving responsibilities? Or are you happy to put your career to a side and be the best possible caregiver that you possibly can? And that really stuck with me. And having that clarity and like, what exactly do I want? What exactly am I optimizing for? Has really helped me being a carer. Without clarity, it's impossible to make a decision. Another thing that he mentioned, and that sort of I think about, is that in caring for an elderly parent, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not, you either have to focus on work and travel and your personal sort of life, or look after, your elderly parents. It's not one or the other. But one thing that really sort of crystallized for me was that I want to be intellectually stimulated. I want to work in a career that's engaging and that's fun. And that's really, really important to me. But at the same time, I want to make sure that the non-negotiables, the core foundations of caregiving, are not lost. And so drawing the line between what's absolutely essential and what I can either outsource or delegate or get some help with was absolutely critical. So with that in mind, I want you to think about this in your own lives for a second. For those of you that still have parents, for those of you that have relatives, uncles, grandmothers, grandparents that have chronic illnesses, what's your plan to look after them? Are you going to take some time off work? Are you just going to provide care for them? Are you going to send them to an aged care centre? And in thinking about these things, I want you to think about that there is no right answer. There's no right or wrong answer here. And there's no answer that's right now, but could be wrong later. And so being comfortable with the idea that some answers can be partially right and some answers can be partially wrong is critical. So what are you optimizing for? Having that clarity is everything. The second key point I'd like to make is a point called continuous improvement. There's a Stanford psychologist who talks about having a growth mindset. And I'm sure you guys have all heard about the growth mindset. It's in a ton of like business books and that you see at an airport that you never buy. It's everywhere. But what is a growth mindset? How does it apply to caregiving? The idea of continuous improvement in the realm of caregiving means that I'm going to be a better carer tomorrow than I was today. What do I mean by that? It's all about using the tools that you would probably use at work, so asking for feedback, quantitative and qualitative analysis, now applying that in your approach to being a carer. The 4 main points that I've observed that sort of work for me is 1, observing, 2, measuring, 3, reflecting, and 4, implementing. Observing. So how is my dad or mum or uncle or aunt doing today? Are they better or worse than what they were yesterday? Like literally asking that question. The second is measuring. So quantitatively measuring people's symptoms. Just like at work you would measure sales, costs, margins, applying the same quantitative and analytical framework in your caregiving responsibilities is really important. Third is reflecting. Understanding why changes are happening. Why are certain movements and patterns moving in certain ways? And last is implementing. How can I take what I've learned today to apply that tomorrow? Another thing I want to mention is that we've all heard the phrase, what gets measured gets managed, and I think that's super applicable here. Your ability to measure quantitatively your caregiving skills will make you a better caregiver. The third point I want to talk about is building resilience. Now, so far, all the things I've said might be a little pragmatic, a little optimistic, but I'm not going to lie to you that looking after an elderly parent with a chronic illness is tough. Really, really tough. Like, you'll have to make compromises and sacrifices. There'll be nights when you want to go out, but you can't really go out. What I've learned both in startups and working in sort of tech companies is that there is a lot of parallels between having a business or working in a startup and looking after an elderly parent. You have to develop grit, the ability to keep going when things hurt, when things suck. So the two main sort of takeaways from resilience for me is one, sort of adaptability. So as a caregiver, you're probably dealing with the NDIS, you're dealing with the ATO, you're dealing with surgeons, you're dealing with doctors, and your ability to keep everyone on side, manage those relationships, is totally key. Just like being a manager at work when you're dealing with competing priorities of an engineer, a sales team, an operations staff, and trying to make everyone happy, that same skill set applies as a caregiver. How do I get all these external stakeholders running in the same direction? Another point I want to talk about is managing relationships. So in organizations, relationships are everything. As a caregiver, relationships are everything as well. Both relationships between you and the person you're providing care for, regulators. Relationships make the process a lot smoother and seamless than it otherwise could have been. My last point is this. Have an oxygen mask ready. What do I mean by having an oxygen mask ready? Who here has been on a flight when suddenly the masks just drop down from overhead? Has that happened to everyone? You've been on a flight, you're hitting some sort of turbulence and like, oh my God, these masks drop down. And you're freaking out. That happened to me once. I took a flight from Surabaya in Indonesia to Jakarta on Garuda Airlines. And so these masks fall down and we're all panicking. You know, we're like, what's going on? Are we going to survive? You know, the person next to me is like praying. I just want to land. And so it's a really stressful, traumatic experience. How does that relate to being a carer? Caregiving is equally traumatic and stressful, but one thing that really comes to mind is what the air hostess would say during that time. What do they say? They always say, put your mask on first before putting it on to someone else. Right? So put your own life jacket first before giving it to someone else. And so applying that in the context of caregiving, you need to make sure that you're sane, healthy, and thriving before you help other people. And for me personally, I've taken on like marathon running and podcasting and, you know, a great network of friends. And if it wasn't for that, there is no way that I could have been an effective caregiver without first looking after my own needs. And so a couple of examples of having your oxygen mask ready is just knowing that, am I burning out? Am I getting restless? Am I running out of patience? Am I snapping? It's okay to seek help. It's okay to say, look, this is too much for me. I need help. It's okay. And that was a big sort of learning point for me. So put your own oxygen mask first before attempting to help those around you. And just a couple of things to conclude on being a caregiver. You know, one of the most important things that you learn from working in a startup or in corporate finance is the idea of thinking outside the box and having sort of innovative solutions. And one of these things is it's basically doing as much research about the illness itself, whether it's speaking to the best sort of neurologist in the country or speaking to the best Alzheimer's person in the country to make sure that you know exactly what's going on and you can step in if required. And so if I have to summarize my sort of talk for tonight in one message, it would be this. It's that the skills, the rigor, the due diligence that you apply at work or in your university lives is the same level of care, due diligence, analytical skills that you should apply as a caregiver. And so caregiving is rewarding, it's frustrating, it's exhilarating, but it's also intoxicating. But it's only intoxicating when you have the feeling of progress. And so to close on that, let me talk about progress. So up on the screen is my dad with stage 3 Parkinson's, shuffled walking. We got him a walker that would help him walk, and we re-engineered the brakes so he could stop effectively. This was a couple of years ago. The disease, as I said, gets worse over time, so this is stage 4. His walking gets even worse. He trips a lot, and you can see he's sort of clutching onto his walker for dear life. And so that was, stage 4, so mid last year. We researched a few hydrotherapy classes and physical therapy classes, and found sort of one of the leading hydrotherapists in the state to do sort of aquatic classes. Late last year, we found one of the best neurologists in the state out of the Austin Hospital to do a pioneering surgery procedure called deep brain stimulation, where they put in electrodes in your brain and send through small electrical currents. And that's what it looks like. And that was early this year. And then following surgery, this is what happens. So for someone that could barely walk, struggled with walking, the effect of taking a quantitative and analytical approach to Parkinson's disease, that is what we could do. Thank you, everyone.